somewhere beneath the familiar story of civilization begins with cities, there is a quieter question that does not fit neatly into timelines. Why did humans begin building monumental structures so early, when so many other things still looked unfinished, when writing had not yet hardened into records, when states had not yet learned to call themselves permanent, when even farming was, in some places, only a tentative experiment? The oldest stones do not introduce themselves. They simply wait, like a sentence with the subject removed. So before the body sinks completely into this comfort, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, only if you genuinely like what is being made here. And if you feel like it, share your location and your local time in the comments, as if leaving a small coordinate on the map of this night. Archaeology works with what survives, not with what was. Stone endures, wood decays, coastlines drown, ash covers, the rest is ground into dust and patience. When people speak about early monuments, they're often speaking about what the earth permitted to remain visible. Yet even with that caution, a stubborn pattern returns. Groups of humans, long before the classic image of cities and rulers, invested enormous effort into shaping landscapes and lifting heavy materials into deliberate forms. It is tempting to think monuments belong to kings, priests and taxes. That model fits later epochs. But the earliest confirmed large communal projects do not always arrive with the usual companions of bureaucracy. In the Near East, at sites associated with the pre-pottery Neolithic, often discussed in connection with places like Göbekli Tepe and its wider landscape, there are carved pillars and carefully arranged enclosures implying planning and coordination beyond a single household. The dates tied to these contexts sit uncomfortably early, near the threshold between the last glacial world and the warmer Holocene. It is not that civilization suddenly appears. It is that organized meaning appears in stone before many other signs of complexity become obvious. That tension unsettles the modern mind because it expects progress to be tidy. First food production, then villages, then temples. But evidence can braid those steps together until cause and effect blur. Did stable food allow monuments? Or did monuments create the social gravity that made stable food worth the trouble? A stone enclosure can be both consequence and catalyst, both product and producer of the community around it. To build something monumental is to do several improbable things at once. It is to persuade many individuals to invest in a shared task whose reward is not immediate. It is to develop coordination, leaders, schedules, obligations, persuasion, charisma, without necessarily leaving behind the administrative debris later societies produce. It is to tolerate friction, quarrels, fatigue, hunger, storms, the long boredom of repetition. The stones remain, but the social mechanics that raised them are mostly gone. There are no minutes from meetings, no payroll lists, no names carved into the corner like a signature. There are only residues, cut marks, toolware, patterns of rebuilding, animal bone suggesting feasting, traces of plants and diets, hints of movement across landscapes. From those fragments, scholars assemble plausible motives. One explanation returns, not because it is romantic, but because it fits how humans behave. Ritual as infrastructure. When a group repeats actions together, moving in rhythm, chanting, carrying, lifting, eating, fasting, nervous systems synchronize. Bonds form that are deeper than contracts. In that light, a monument is not merely a structure. It is a machine for producing belonging, a fixed stage that trains bodies to share a story. Another explanation is competition, not necessarily conquest, but prestige. When groups meet, they compare. They trade, marry, feud, imitate, outdo. A big building becomes a visible claim. We're organized. We're not fragile. Our myths are heavy enough to require stone. And ritual and prestige do not cancel each other. A feast can be devotion and display at the same time. Then there is climate, the hand that does not care about human plans. The end of the last ice age was punctuated by abrupt shifts that reshaped ecosystems. When seasons become uncertain, humans search for patterns, and when they cannot find them, they build them. A monument in this sense can be an anchor for time, the place where gatherings recur, where memory is rehearsed until it feels stable, and yet, beneath these reasonable explanations, an unease remains. Some early structures imply an intensity of symbolism and planning, repeated forms, deliberate sequences of construction and renewal, imagery that feels less like decoration and more like vocabulary. Such behaviours hint at cultural memory strong enough to persist across generations without writing. If that is true, then the earliest monuments are not the beginning of meaning, but the evidence of meaning already accumulated. This is where the historical gap opens wider. What if earlier monumental traditions were made of wood, fibre and earth, materials that rot, burn and vanish? What if ceremonial centres lay on coastlines, now submerged under post-glacial sea level rise? The sea does not merely drown land. It erases the argument, leaving later observers to mistake absence for simplicity. Even the labels can mislead. Hunter-gatherer is not one lifestyle. Some foragers are highly mobile, others are seasonally sedentary, some manage landscapes, some concentrate around rich rivers and coasts, some develop complex social rules without agriculture. If that diversity is taken seriously, monumental building becomes less like a miracle and more like one outcome among many, emerging when ecology, belief and social opportunity align. Still, the question refuses to settle. Why do humans, again and again, choose the hardest material, the slowest method, the most exhausting labour when lighter and easier solutions exist? Perhaps because the point is not efficiency. Perhaps the point is weight, the deliberate choice to make an idea heavy enough that it cannot be carried away by a single season, a single leader, a single disaster. If monuments were already teaching humans to think in centuries, what kind of pressure, fear, hope, loss, or memory first taught them that they needed such long thoughts at all? The unanswered question from the last step still hangs in the air. What pressure teaches a community to think in centuries before it can reliably write a sentence to the future? One way to approach it is to walk toward the places where the stones are undeniably early, and then notice how uncertain the explanations become the closer you stand. In the limestone uplands of southeastern Anatolia, on a rise that once looked ordinary, archaeologists uncovered circular and oval enclosures framed by towering T-shaped pillars, many carved with animals that seemed to move even while trapped in rock. The site is known as Göbekli Tepe, and it is now discussed alongside a broader constellation of early Neolithic sites across the region. What unsettles people is not only the craftsmanship but the timing. These structures belong to the opening millennia of the Holocene, before the familiar architecture of palaces, city walls and written archives. The temptation is to name such a place quickly, to give it a comfortable category. Temple is the word that often appears, because it offers a neat logic: religion first, civilization later. Yet the word carries assumptions: specialists, institutions, perhaps a permanent priesthood, perhaps an economy that can support people who do not hunt, gather or farm for their meals. The evidence can suggest gatherings and ritual without proving that kind of hierarchy. It can show planning without revealing the shape of authority. The pillars are persuasive, but they do not sign their own interpretation. So the explanations hover and compete, each carrying a different image of early humans. One image sees mobile groups drawn together by periodic ceremonies that kept alliances alive. Another sees communities already leaning toward longer stays in one place, with cultivation and herding beginning to tighten their schedules, making it possible to return again and again to the same sacred landscape. Some researchers emphasize feasting, large gatherings that demanded large amounts of food and perhaps drink, where hosting could translate into prestige and prestige could translate into cooperation. In that frame, monuments are not extra. They are social infrastructure, The carvings deepen the puzzle. Foxes, boars, snakes, birds, and other creatures appear in relief, not as gentle decoration but as repeated deliberate signals. They can be read as clan emblems, mythic figures, warnings, or a map of the surrounding ecosystem. Some interpretations reach toward shamanic symbolism, where animals are more than animals, and the boundary between human and non-human is porous in imagination. Even if the symbolism remains disputed, a simpler fact is hard to ignore. Someone cared to carve meaning into stone with enough consistency that patterns repeat. That implies shared understanding, a stable symbolic vocabulary, and memory strong enough to persist through seasons of hunger and distraction. The architecture itself behaves as if it were built for a kind of choreography. Many enclosures include two larger central pillars facing each other, surrounded by smaller ones, as though a gathering space was arranged around a pair of silent presences. Some scholars see stylized humans in those T-shapes, arms, belts, cloth-like carvings, making the pillars feel less like posts and more like standing bodies. If that reading is correct, then the site is not merely a place where people built walls, it is a place where they made an audience out of stone. And then comes the detail that feels like a hand over the mouth of the past. Several enclosures appear to have been deliberately backfilled, covered with rubble and sediment in ways that suggest intentional closure rather than simple abandonment. Why invest in raising a space, then choose to bury it? One explanation treats the act as ritual, sealing what was sacred, closing a chapter, renewing the landscape, or protecting a place that had become too charged to leave open. Another explanation is more practical, shifting social centres, changing conditions, rebuilding elsewhere. But the deliberate nature of the covering leaves room for an uneasy thought. Less a conspiracy than a human habit, communities curate what remains visible, even for people not yet born. This is also where the modern mind can become impatient. When something is buried, it wants a secret. When something is early, it wants a lost civilization. The safer stance is to hold two truths at once. Deliberate burial does not require a hidden empire, and yet it does show a willingness to control what future eyes might see. Absence can be natural, but it can also be chosen. Göbekli Tepe and its neighbouring sites taken together act like mirrors. They reflect the limits of tidy categories. They show that coordinated labour, symbolic complexity and landscape-scale planning can exist before the classic package of civilization fully forms. They suggest that humans could assemble periodically at ritual centres without living there permanently, a pattern closer to pilgrimage than city life. They also hint that the boundary between forager and farmer is not a clean line but a foggy gradient filled with experiments, failures and hybrid ways of living. Around it, other excavations in the same broad cultural horizon complicate the idea of a single anomaly. Similar pillar traditions and early communal buildings appear across the region in varying forms, as if the impulse belonged to a network of communities rather than one isolated genius. That matters because it shifts the question from who invented the first monument to what kind of world makes many groups arrive at the same solution. When an idea spreads without writing, it spreads through visits, marriages, seasonal gatherings, and imitation, through the slow human internet of footsteps and rumour. If monuments were part of that shared language, then the stones are not only local achievements, they are nodes in a wider conversation. Still, the original unease refuses to fade. A monument is not only belief made visible, it is logistics made real. Someone quarried those stones, someone shaped them, someone organised hauling, lifting, placement, and the repeated return to work across seasons. The stones do not tell us how many hands were involved, how disagreements were settled, or what promises were made to keep people from walking away. If the earliest monumental landscapes were not built by rulers with armies, but by communities bound together through ritual, memory, and necessity, what invisible systems of obligation and coordination were already operating? Quiet enough to leave no written record, yet strong enough to move stone as if stone were light. The last question lingers like a weight that cannot be placed down. What invisible system can persuade hundreds of hands to behave like one body, without leaving behind the obvious fingerprints of a state? The answer, if it exists, is not carved into the pillars. It is hidden in the mechanics of moving matter through space, through friction, leverage, rope fiber, muscle fatigue, and the strange psychology that makes effort feel meaningful when it is shared. To imagine early monumental building honestly, the mind has to abandon the modern habit of assuming machines. Stone does not move itself. If metal is absent, if wheels are rare or non-existent, if draft animals are not yet domesticated at scale, then every metre of transport becomes a story of technique and stubbornness. Archaeologists and experimental builders have tried to translate this into practical experience, because sometimes the only way to understand an ancient decision is to feel it in the shoulders. With wooden rollers, sledges, wet clay and coordinated pulling, heavy loads can be shifted. With levers, wedges, and patient incremental lifts, large stones can be raised. None of this is magic. It is physics, repeated until it becomes culture. But physics alone does not explain why anyone would choose to do it. A structure, like a stone enclosure, is also a test of time. It requires returning to the same goal again and again, not merely for an afternoon, but across seasons. That raises a quiet suspicion. The builders must have had a reason powerful enough to override the short-term logic of survival. Hunger does not negotiate politely. Winter does not accept symbolic payment. So either the work was timed to seasons of abundance, or the builders had a way to store enough food to support gatherings, or the building itself was part of the mechanism that created abundance, through social alliances that enabled broader access to resources. This is where feasting returns, not as a romantic image of celebration, but as an economic and political technology. A large feast is a way to turn stored resources into social credit. It is a way to bind people through obligation. You eat at my fire. You remember my generosity. You owe me attention. You owe me future help. In many ethnographic settings, communal work is made possible through communal reward. Food, drink, music, prestige, mating opportunities, alliances. The reward does not need to be centralized taxation. It can be social gravity, an invisible accounting system written in memory and reputation. The evidence for large gatherings is not always direct, but there are hints that fit. Concentrations of animal bones can suggest episodes of mass consumption. Large stone vessels and architectural spaces can imply communal activity. Yet these traces are interpretive, and the responsible approach is to hold them lightly. A pile of bones is a clue, not a verdict. Still, the idea that monuments may have been built in bursts during seasonal aggregation events feels plausible because it matches how mobile and semi-sedentary groups can accomplish large tasks without permanent urban infrastructure. People converge, build, feast, negotiate marriages, exchange knowledge, then disperse again, carrying the shared story back to their territories. If this is correct, monumental sites become less like isolated buildings and more like periodic engines, places where society is rebuilt each year, like a ritual repair of the social fabric. In that frame, stone is not only material, it is schedule. It tells people when to return. It becomes the anchor that keeps a network from dissolving into scattered survival units. Yet another layer complicates the picture. The work itself can transform the group. When humans strain together, when they synchronize effort, they enter a shared rhythm. There is a reason chants exist, why drums appear in human culture so often, why repeated motion can induce trance-like focus. The physiology of coordination can blur the boundary between individual and collective. In modern terms, it is called collective effervescence. But the label is less important than the effect, a feeling that something larger than the self is present. That feeling can make labour feel holy. If early monuments were built under the influence of such shared states, then organization does not require bureaucracy. It requires ritualized timing, charismatic leadership, and a story strong enough to make people endure hardship willingly. The story does not have to be written. It can be sung, danced, enacted. It can be embodied. And still, there is the problem of precision. Monumental building is not only about brute force, it also demands measurement, alignment, spacing, stability, foundations. Even if those measurements are simple by modern standards, they imply knowledge transmitted reliably. How to choose stone, how to avoid collapse, how to create surfaces that fit. This knowledge could live in specialists, craftspeople who accumulate skill over decades. Such specialists do not need to be full-time salaried workers. They can be people who, season after season, return to the same place and become known for their hands. Their authority can be informal, woven into reputation rather than enforced by soldiers. This suggests a society with subtle hierarchy, not necessarily kings, but respected builders, ritual leaders, elders with memory, people whose advice is followed because the community has watched them succeed. The stone might preserve the end result of their competence, while the social structure that supported them disappears. There is also a darker possibility, one that does not need drama to feel heavy. Large projects can be coercive without being states. Social pressure can be a leash, shame can be a whip. The fear of exclusion can force compliance. If belonging is the most valuable resource, then the threat of losing it can mobilize labor as effectively as any tax. Early monumental building, then, might not only be about joy and unity. It might also be about control, soft control, communal control, the kind that leaves no chains in the soil but can still dictate behavior. The record is too silent to settle this, and perhaps it always will be. Stones show accomplishment, not consent. But there is another kind of silence worth hearing. The monuments that never survived. Early humans built in wood, in earth, in fibre. Timber circles and earthworks can be monumental too, yet they are far more vulnerable to rot and erosion. If the earliest large structures were often made of perishable materials, then what is now called early monumentality might only be the visible tip of a much older habit. Stone may not mark the beginning of the impulse. It may simply mark the moment when the impulse chose a medium that resists forgetting. If monuments are the fossilized skeleton of a social process, labor, ritual, memory, obligation, then the crucial question is not only how humans move stones, but why they began moving themselves, repeatedly, toward the same shared point on the landscape, as if pulled by an invisible tide. What was that tide made of? Devotion, fear, rivalry, hunger, or something else that leaves no artifact except the decision to return? The last image remained stubborn, people returning again and again to the same point on the land as if pulled by a tide made of something invisible. If stone is the fossil, then the living creature is the ritual that once moved through those spaces. And ritual, when stripped of romance, is not merely belief. It is an engineered repetition that shapes attention, memory, and obedience, sometimes gently, sometimes with a pressure so quiet it can be mistaken for comfort. A monumental structure is a strange solution to a human problem. It does not feed anyone by itself. It does not heal a wound. It does not keep the rain away as efficiently as a smaller shelter could. And yet, for reasons that recur across cultures, humans keep building places that are larger than necessity. The question begins to shift here from logistics to psychology. What does a monument do to the mind that a simple campfire cannot? It changes scale. It alters the body's sense of proportion. When a person stands beside a pillar that rises higher than any individual, the nervous system receives a message without words. Something here is bigger than you, older than you, meant to outlast you. That sensation can be awe, and awe is not neutral. Awe can dissolve the self, soften skepticism, make people more willing to submit to a shared story. This is not mysticism. It is a well-observed human response. Large spaces, high ceilings, deep echoes, these things reshape the way thoughts arrive. If early communities discovered, even accidentally, that certain environments produce certain states of mind, then monuments become a kind of cognitive tool. They are not only religious in the narrow sense, they are technologies for coordinating human brains. They can gather attention the way gravity gathers dust, and when attention is gathered, it can be guided. Consider how little is required to turn work into ceremony. A rhythm, repeated, a chant, simple enough for everyone, a sequence of actions that always happens the same way, at the same place, under the same sky. When many bodies move together, pulling, lifting, carrying, breathing falls into patterns, footsteps find tempo, fatigue becomes shared. In that shared tempo, disagreements can become quieter. Individual hesitation can be absorbed by collective motion. It becomes easier to obey the group than to resist it, not because someone is violent, but because the group is loud in the mind. This suggests an uncomfortable possibility, that the act of building may have been inseparable from the act of bonding. The monument was not merely the goal, the construction process was part of the ritual. The work itself could have been the ceremony that made the society feel like a single organism. If so, then the structure's purpose is not only what happened after it was finished, but what happened while it was being raised. There are subtle archaeological hints that communal gatherings could be intense and periodic rather than constant. Seasonal aggregation makes sense in many environments. Groups disperse when resources are scattered, then converge when resources concentrate, or when a particular season makes travel easier. At those convergence points, social life becomes dense. Marriages are arranged, disputes are settled or reignited, alliances are renewed, stories are performed publicly, so memory becomes collective, not private. In such moments, a monument functions like a stage, but also like a referee. It tells people where to stand, where to look, what matters. If the monument is a stage, then it also raises the question of performers. Not actors in a modern sense, but specialists, story keepers, ritual leaders, builders whose competence is itself a kind of authority. Authority is often imagined as a crown. But in early societies, authority can be a voice that knows the right song, a hand that knows the right cut, an elder who remembers the last famine and therefore speaks with the weight of survival. When those people stand in the centre of a monumental space, their words and gestures are amplified, not only acoustically but socially. The architecture lends them gravity. This is one reason monumental building can appear before the state. A state is a formalised architecture of power. A monument can be an earlier architecture of influence, less explicit, more intimate. It can teach people to accept coordination as normal. It can train the community to think in terms of we, and to feel anxious when we is threatened. Yet the line between social healing and social control is thin. A shared ritual can soothe fear, but it can also manufacture fear. A place that binds a community can also bind it too tightly. The same mechanism that creates belonging can create exclusion. If a site becomes sacred, then not everyone is equally entitled to it. Some may be invited, some tolerated, some forbidden. Such boundaries do not require walls with guards. They can be enforced by rumour, taboo, and the dread of being cast out of the story. And then there is the matter of the dead, which always waits nearby in early human landscapes. Even when a structure is not a tomb, it can function as a conversation with mortality. Humans are the animals who remember the absent. We imagine future listeners. We feel the pressure of ancestors we cannot see. Monumental building may be a way of making absence visible, a way of giving grief a shape that can be returned to. A stone enclosure, a mound, a standing pillar. These can become anchors for memory, ensuring that the dead do not dissolve completely into the forest of forgetting. If that is true, The earliest monuments might be less about worship in the abstract and more about continuity under threat. When climate shifts, when prey patterns change, when familiar plants fail, when epidemics strike, the community's greatest fear is not only starvation, it is disintegration. People scatter, alliances fracture. Knowledge is lost because the people who carry it die or drift away. In that context, a monumental gathering place becomes a lifeline. It says, return here, repeat the story, remember who belongs, remember what to do. But even as this explanation begins to feel plausible, it collides with another silence. If monuments were cognitive tools, why do so few early voices survive to tell us what they believed? The answer is obvious and still disturbing. Belief does not fossilize. Ritual leaves footprints, not transcripts. Symbols can endure as carvings, but their meanings shift, fracture, and multiply. A fox carved in stone can be a clan emblem, a predator, a trickster spirit, a constellation, a taboo, a joke, or a warning. The monument may be a stable object holding unstable interpretations across generations. And this instability opens the door to an especially haunting idea. Monuments may have been built precisely because meaning is unstable. When stories drift, stone can pin them down. When memory fades, architecture can force the body to remember, by making people walk the same path, face the same central pillars, gather in the same ring of shadows. The monument becomes a discipline of memory. If early monumental building was partly a response to the fear of forgetting, fear of social collapse, fear of lost knowledge, fear of the dead becoming truly gone, then the next question becomes sharper and more unsettling. What was happening in the world that made forgetting feel so dangerous that humans chose to fight it with stone, as if memory itself needed fortifications? The question from the previous step tightens like a knot. What was happening in the world that made forgetting feel dangerous enough to deserve fortifications of stone? When a community chooses monumentality, it is often because the ground beneath ordinary life no longer feels reliable. Not only the literal ground, but the patterns that make a world predictable. Seasons, migrations, rains, the quiet expectation that tomorrow will resemble yesterday. When those patterns falter, humans do something peculiar. They begin to search for permanence. The end of the last ice age was not a gentle fade-out. It was a complicated sequence of warming, cooling, and abrupt shifts that reshaped ecosystems across vast regions. Glaciers retreated, coastlines moved, rivers changed courses, forests expanded or vanished, and animals that had been familiar for countless generations withdrew or disappeared. The human groups living through that time did not experience climate change as a statistic. They experienced it as uncertainty stitched into every decision: where to travel, what to hunt, when to gather, how long a place would remain safe. Among the most discussed episodes is the Younger Dryas, a sudden return to colder conditions that interrupted the general warming trend near the start of the Holocene. Scholars debate details, causes, regional variability, the precise ways it affected different communities. But what matters for this story is less the single mechanism and more the lived consequence. A reminder that the world could shift quickly, without warning, and that old strategies might fail. In such a context, human behavior often reorganizes around risk management. People diversify food sources. They cultivate plants more deliberately. They return to reliable water. They strengthen alliances. They invent new ways to store not just calories, but trust. Monumental sites can be read as part of this risk response, not because stone itself solves hunger, but because it can stabilize social networks. When resources become unpredictable, cooperation becomes more valuable. But cooperation is fragile. It requires repeated reinforcement, and reinforcement requires places and rituals where obligations are renewed. A monumental gathering point can serve as a neutral ground, a place to negotiate access to territory, to arrange exchanges, to settle disputes, to redistribute food through feasts, to decide who owes what to whom. These acts are not bureaucratic, but they are political in the deepest sense. They organise life. There is also a quieter, darker factor that rarely appears in heroic narratives: loss of land. As the ice melted, sea levels rose, and the coastlines of the world shifted inward. Entire landscapes that had once been inhabited, valleys, plains, river mouths, were gradually submerged. If people had lived and moved across those now drowned spaces, then the retreating shoreline would have been experienced as a slow, relentless theft. Campsites, hunting grounds, burial places, sacred groves, taken by the sea, not in a day, but in a lifetime, like a patient erasure. This matters because it changes how early monuments might appear. If some of the oldest ceremonial sites were on coasts or near river deltas, they may now lie underwater, inaccessible or destroyed. What remains visible on land could be the survivors, not the first attempts. The monumental tradition might already have been older by the time it becomes archaeologically obvious. The sea is not merely a force of nature here, it is an editor of history, removing chapters and leaving later readers to assume the book begins where the surviving pages begin, and if people watch their world literally disappear, it would sharpen an anxiety already present in the human mind, the fear that the past can be swallowed. In that atmosphere, building in stone becomes an act of defiance, even if unconscious. It is a way of saying that something will not move, even if the shoreline does. A monument can be a refusal to accept that everything is temporary. Yet climate and sea level rise are still broad explanations. They describe the stage, but not the individual impulse. To get closer, it helps to consider how abrupt environmental stress can amplify myth. When the world becomes unpredictable, stories become more serious, not because people suddenly become irrational, but because stories function as survival codes. A myth can encode seasonal knowledge, social rules, taboo boundaries that protect resources, and warnings about dangerous behaviours. When stress increases, the enforcement of those codes can intensify. Ritual becomes stricter. Symbolic boundaries harden. Sacred places become more central. In that sense, early monuments may also be memory devices designed to hold complex, multi-generational knowledge in a form that cannot be forgotten easily. A place can store information the way a book does, not through letters but through repetition. The structure tells the body how to move, the carvings tell the eye what to notice, the alignment tells the community when to gather. Each return is a rehearsal, and each rehearsal is a way of keeping knowledge alive without writing. There is a reason the idea of catastrophe keeps haunting discussions of early monumentality, even among careful scholars who avoid sensationalism. Not because a single apocalypse must be invoked, but because the late Pleistocene and early Holocene were indeed eras of enormous transition, with local disasters, floods, droughts, fires, stacked on top of global shifts. Rivers can change course violently, carving new channels and abandoning old ones. Volcanic events can veil skies. Storm patterns can alter. When communities live close to the edge of survival, even moderate shifts can feel like the world ending. But there is a further complication: human perception of time. Without written chronologies, the past can compress. A series of difficult decades can become, in oral tradition, the time the world changed. A flood that happened once can become a flood. A famine becomes a curse. A migration becomes an exile. Such stories do not need to be false to become mythic. They become mythic because they are repeatedly retold as moral and social lessons. Over generations, they can motivate behaviour, including monumental building, because building becomes a way to prevent the story from happening again. This is where the idea of reset begins to tempt the imagination. It is easy to picture civilization restarting after a disaster, or knowledge being lost, or survivors rebuilding under a new sky. Some researchers and popular writers have taken this temptation far, suggesting advanced lost cultures. The evidence for such extreme claims remains contested and often rejected in mainstream scholarship, but the emotional instinct behind them is understandable. The archaeological record genuinely contains gaps, and environmental upheaval genuinely occurred. The careful path is to acknowledge the gaps without filling them with certainty. A reset can be social without being technological. Alliances break, traditions vanish, skills are forgotten, and later groups inherit only fragments, rebuilding with partial memory. If monumental building emerges from a world where the environment is shifting, coastlines are drowning histories, and communities fear the fragility of memory, then the next question becomes almost inevitable. When a society builds in stone to resist forgetting, what exactly is it trying to remember? Or what is it trying to prevent itself from remembering too clearly? The question from the last step feels like it carries two edges. When a society builds in stone to resist forgetting, what is it trying to remember? Or what is it trying to prevent itself from remembering too clearly? Memory is not a neutral archive. It is a tool, sometimes a weapon, and often a comfort that costs something. Monumental building, seen through that lens, begins to look less like a celebration of permanence and more like a negotiation with the unbearable. There is a quiet paradox at the heart of early monumentality. Many of the most compelling monumental sites appear in a period when humans were also beginning to trap themselves in place. Sedentism is often described as progress, but it is also confinement. To stay is to accept a smaller world, to return to the same water sources, the same soils, the same neighbours, the same conflicts. Mobility can be a form of freedom and an escape from scarcity. Settling is a wager that the land will provide enough to justify the loss of that freedom. In the archaeological record of the early Neolithic, this shift is visible in subtle ways. Architecture becomes more durable, storage becomes more pronounced, and the pattern of repeated rebuilding in the same location suggests long-term attachment. Yet, crucially, monumental structures do not always wait politely for full sedentary village life to stabilize. Instead, they often appear amid the transition, as if monumentality and domestication were entangled in a knot rather than arranged in a clean sequence. This has produced a persistent debate. One strand of interpretation suggests that once humans began cultivating plants and managing animals, they created surpluses that could support large construction projects. Food storage reduces risk, freeing time and energy for labour beyond immediate survival. In that view, monuments are the flowering of economic stability. But another strand reverses the direction. It suggests that the social demands of gathering, ritual feasts, seasonal assemblies, the need to host and impress, may have created pressures that made cultivation attractive in the first place. If a community wants to feed large gatherings reliably, it may begin to manage landscapes more intensively. In that view, monuments are not the result of agriculture. They are one of the forces that pulled agriculture into existence. Neither direction can be proven universally, and the truth may differ by region and by century. But the very existence of this debate is revealing. It means that monumental building is not merely an accessory to settled life. It may be part of what taught humans to accept settled life. A monument can anchor return. Return becomes habit. Habit becomes attachment. Attachment becomes village. Village becomes a new kind of human being, one who thinks of land as home rather than territory. Yet settling introduces new vulnerabilities. A mobile group can move away from exhausted resources or hostile neighbours. A settled community cannot. It must defend, it must store, it must manage waste, disease, and conflict in closer quarters. It must endure the presence of strangers who are no longer strangers, because everyone is trapped in the same place. In this environment, shared identity becomes even more important. Monuments, again, look like infrastructure, not just for belief but for cohesion. They tell people who they are and who they are not. They define the centre of a world that has stopped moving. This is where the psychological role of monuments intensifies. When life becomes more constrained, anxiety finds new shapes. Property disputes emerge. Inheritance becomes relevant. The dead begin to matter differently because land is no longer simply a root, it becomes a possession. Burials can become claims. Ancestors can become legal arguments, even without writing. The presence of the dead beneath floors, in chambers or near communal spaces, an arrangement known from several early Neolithic contexts, can be interpreted as intimacy, reverence, or continuity. But it can also be read as territorial logic. The dead are placed where the living need them, as witnesses who cannot contradict. If monuments stabilize memory, then they can also stabilize ownership. The body, too, becomes part of this stabilization. Daily routines in settled communities are repetitive: grinding, hauling water, tending, repairing, guarding. Repetition can dull the mind. Ritual becomes the counterbalance, the moment when repetition is transfigured into meaning. The structure of a communal building, its echo, its shadows, its deliberate geometry, can provide that transfiguration. It can turn a labouring population into a congregation, even if no formal religion exists in the later sense. It can make the exhausting bargain of settlement feel justified. And the bargain is real. Early cultivation often produces worse health at first, less dietary diversity, more disease, more labour, more dependence on a few crops. This is one of the strangest facts of human history. People did not necessarily become healthier when they began farming. In many cases, they became more burdened. So why persist? The answer may involve social forces stronger than individual preference, population growth, territorial competition, the need to feed alliances, the momentum of habit. Once settled life begins, it can become difficult to reverse without losing everything built around it. In that context, monuments may function like locks on a door. They make leaving psychologically harder. If the community is invested in stone, leaving feels like betrayal of ancestors, of identity, of sacred obligation. Monumental building can convert a practical settlement into a moral one. It can bind people not only to land, but to the idea that they must stay. This binding does not require a visible oppressor. It can be enforced by the community itself. A shared monument can become a shared surveillance system, not cameras, but eyes, gossip, expectations, and the fear of being the one who refuses to participate. The same architecture that produces awe can produce conformity. At this point, the story begins to flirt with the theme of control, not as a modern conspiracy, but as an ancient human tendency. Whenever knowledge becomes valuable, when timing of seasons, locations of water, or social alliances determine survival, knowledge becomes power. Those who claim access to the right story, the right ritual, the right interpretation of symbols can gain influence. They can decide who belongs, who is pure, who is blamed when crops fail. In the absence of writing, such control can be even stronger, because the story cannot be checked against an archive. The archive is the living memory of the leaders, and the monument is the stage where that memory is performed. And yet, it is important to resist turning this into certainty. Influence can be benevolent. Ritual leaders can be healers. Elders can be guardians of practical wisdom. Monuments can be genuine expressions of shared devotion, rather than instruments of oppression. The evidence does not force one moral conclusion. It only suggests that monumentality creates the conditions for social power to concentrate, even in subtle forms. If early monuments helped pull humans into settled life, and settled life sharpened the stakes of memory, identity, and control, then the next layer of fog begins to form around a haunting possibility. Were the first monumental builders trying to preserve a fragile order against the chaos of a changing world? Or were they already trying to rewrite their own past, selecting which memories would be sanctified in stone and which would be buried under the floor like something too dangerous to carry forward. The last possibility does not announce itself loudly, but it lingers with a kind of quiet menace. If monuments preserve memory, they can also curate it. They can choose what is sacred enough to stand and what is inconvenient enough to be sealed beneath layers of soil and silence. At that point, the question shifts from why humans built early monuments to what kind of truth a monument is allowed to hold. When people imagine early monumental structures, they often picture brute effort and raw faith. Yet monuments also imply planning that reaches beyond immediate survival. Planning requires timekeeping, and timekeeping is one of the oldest forms of power. To know when rains return, when herds migrate, when certain plants appear, when the river behaves differently, this knowledge can mean life or death. Even without writing, humans can develop sophisticated seasonal calendars through careful observation, repeated storytelling, and rituals that lock those observations into the body. This is why the sky begins to matter in the story of stone. In many later monumental traditions, alignments with celestial events appear. Solstices, equinoxes, heliacal risings, lunar cycles. The evidence and interpretation vary by site, and scholars debate intent versus coincidence, but the broader pattern is hard to ignore. Humans repeatedly build structures that interact with light and shadow at specific times, as if trying to catch the passage of time in architecture. The temptation is to project famous later examples backward, to assume that early builders must have been astronomers in the modern sense. The more careful approach is to recognize that you do not need mathematics to notice the sun's turning points. You only need patience, and humans have always had patience when survival depends on it. If early monumental sites functioned as gathering points tied to seasonal cycles, then subtle orientation could serve practical and social functions at once. A structure that cues the timing of a gathering also cues the timing of alliances, trade, marriages, and the redistribution of food. It turns natural cycles into social schedules. It makes the sky a clock the community shares, and that shared clock becomes a form of agreement, an agreement written in light. But there is a more unsettling dimension. A calendar is not only a tool for knowing, it is a tool for commanding. If a small number of people are trusted to interpret signs, shadows, star patterns, seasonal changes, they can guide group behavior. They can decide when the community should gather, when it should fast, when it should plant, when it should prepare for scarcity. Even if their interpretations are honest, their role becomes powerful. The monument can be their instrument, because it makes the interpretation feel objective. The sun does not argue. The shadow falls where it falls. Architecture can turn an uncertain world into an apparently certain message. This is not to claim deceit. It is to highlight the strange intimacy between observation and authority. A monument can make an interpretation feel like destiny. The carvings and repeated motifs in early monumental contexts complicate the picture further. Symbolic systems can serve as mnemonic devices. A certain animal, posture, or arrangement might cue a story, a rule, a taboo, or a warning about the landscape. If so, then monumental art is not decoration. It is a storage medium for information. It keeps knowledge stable across generations by embedding it in a place that people must return to. The body learns the route, the eye learns the reliefs, and the story follows. And stories once stabilized can become selective. Every oral tradition faces a tension between flexibility and preservation. Flexibility allows adaptation. Preservation protects identity. Monumentality pushes toward preservation. When a community invests in stone, it is less likely to allow the meaning of that stone to drift too far, because drift threatens the legitimacy of the investment. A stable monument encourages stable interpretation. Stable interpretation encourages stable hierarchy. And stable hierarchy encourages the kind of memory that serves the hierarchy. This is where the idea of rewriting begins to feel less like modern paranoia and more like a quiet ancient inevitability, not because someone sat down and forged a historical record, but because communities always interpret their origins in ways that justify their present. If settlement is fragile, if land ownership is contested, if alliances are tense, then the story of who we have always been becomes a weapon. The monument becomes proof, even if the proof is symbolic rather than literal. It says, "We were here, we gathered here, our ancestors sanctified this place. Therefore, we belong." The archaeological record can sometimes show deliberate acts that hint at this curation. Structures that are intentionally buried, rebuilt, or reshaped can indicate that people wanted to close certain spaces and emphasize others. Burials placed under floors can suggest intimacy, but also ownership and legitimacy. Skulls preserved or displayed, a practice discussed at several early Neolithic sites, can be read as ancestor veneration, but also as the visible anchoring of lineage and claim. Again, the evidence does not force one interpretation, but it keeps opening the same door. Memory is never only memory. Even the sky can be curated. A monument oriented to a particular sunrise can make that sunrise feel like it belongs to the group. It can become a ritual moment owned by the community, a private appointment with the cosmos. In a world where people fear instability, claiming such moments can feel like claiming control. And yet, there is a counter-pressure. The sky is also uncontrollable. It can refuse. Storms can hide the sun. Unusual seasons can make the calendar seem wrong. When that happens, belief systems strain. Ritual leaders must interpret anomalies. The community must decide whether the anomaly is punishment, accident, or omen. This is how anxiety can expand into mythology. The monument, originally a tool of stability, becomes a stage for explaining instability. If, during the early Holocene, humans faced real environmental uncertainty, and if they responded by building structures that anchored time and meaning, then the monuments may record not only confidence, but fear. A calendar is most valuable when the world is least predictable. A gathering ritual is most necessary when alliances are most fragile. A stone memory machine is most urgent when forgetting threatens survival. From this angle, early monumentality begins to look like an attempt to negotiate with time itself, an effort to trap cycles, fix rituals, and make the future less ambiguous. Yet the act of fixing inevitably creates a new problem. Once a story is fixed in stone, it becomes harder to admit that the story might be wrong. And that leads to the next question, one that is uncomfortable precisely because it is plausible. If monuments helped early communities claim stability through calendars, symbols, and repeated gatherings, what happened when reality refused to match the story, when the season shifted, when resources collapsed, when rival groups challenged claims? Did monuments become instruments of adaptation, or did they become prisons of belief, forcing people to defend a narrative even as the world changed around it? The question from the last step settles like a cold hand. When reality refuses to match the story, does a monument help a community adapt, or does it trap the community inside a narrative it can no longer afford? It is an old problem, and it does not only belong to ancient people. Any society that builds something permanent eventually discovers that permanence can become stubborn. Stone does not change its mind quickly, and that is why the next layer of fog turns towards something that seems secondary at first, but quietly shapes belief more than most people admit: sound. Before writing, before books, before archives, the primary technology of memory was the human voice. A story survived because it could be spoken, sung, repeated, and heard. In that world, architecture is not only something you see, it is something you hear. A built space can amplify a whisper, sharpen a chant, deepen a drum. It can turn ordinary speech into something that feels larger than the speaker. something that seems to come from the place itself. Acoustics is easy to overlook because the archaeological record is so visual. Pillars, walls, carvings, these are what remain. But for the people who gathered in those spaces, the experience would have been embodied. Footsteps on packed earth, breath in cold air, the crack of flint, the low animal noise of a crowd, the sudden focus when a leader speaks. In an enclosure, sound can behave differently. It can bounce, return, surround. It can make a single voice feel omnipresent. It can make silence feel heavy. Studies of prehistoric caves and chambered sites in various regions have suggested that resonance and echo may have been meaningful, whether intentionally sought or simply noticed and incorporated into ritual practice. In some spaces, a drum beat can roll like thunder. In others, a certain note can cause the air to tremble. Humans do not need physics to interpret this. The nervous system interprets it automatically. Resonance can feel like presence. Echo can feel like an answer. A low-frequency vibration can be felt in the chest, making emotion physical. If early monumental spaces produced distinctive acoustic effects, then they could have served as powerful tools for shaping collective states of mind. A chant repeated in a resonant enclosure can induce trance-like focus. A repeated rhythm can narrow attention. A group can be synchronized not only by movement, but by sound. And once attention is narrowed, the story that enters that narrow channel can feel more certain than it deserves. This matters because it suggests an explanation for why monuments were worth the cost even when resources were scarce. A monument is a technology for intensifying experience. It makes gatherings more memorable. It makes rituals harder to forget. It makes emotion reliable. If a community depends on periodic gatherings to maintain alliances, then making those gatherings unforgettable is not luxury, it is strategy. At the same time, the intensification of experience can produce dependency. A community may begin to require the monument to feel fully itself. Without the gathering place, without the echo, without the familiar ritual sequence, identity can feel threatened. The monument becomes not just a stage, but a stabilizer for the nervous system of the group. This is where adaptation becomes complicated. When the world changes, the community may cling more tightly to the space that makes it feel stable, even if that space is no longer practical. There is an eerie parallel in later history. When societies face stress, they often invest more in symbolic displays, more in ritual, more in grand construction, as if louder meaning could silence fear. Monumentality can surge not because times are good, but because times are uncertain. The building becomes a response to anxiety, a way to insist that something is still under control. But sound also reveals something else. Authority can be performed. In an acoustic space, a single person's voice can seem amplified by the world itself. A chant leader can appear to command not only people but the air. A ritual specialist who knows the right rhythm can orchestrate emotion. In a pre-literate society where memory is held in performance, the person who controls performance controls the archive. This returns to the earlier theme of curation. If monuments fix stories, and sound delivers those stories into bodies, then the combination can be remarkably powerful. It can preserve knowledge, yes, but it can also preserve hierarchy. It can make a narrative feel inevitable. And then there is the role of silence. Monuments create silence by separating a space from ordinary noise. A ring of stone or a constructed chamber can make the outside world feel distant. In that quiet, attention turns inward. The mind becomes more suggestible. Silence is not empty. It is a canvas. A leader's words can land more heavily. A symbol carved on a pillar can feel like it is watching. The boundary between external world and internal world becomes porous. If a monument can create a state where people are more open to certain stories, then it can also become a place where uncomfortable realities are reinterpreted. A failed harvest becomes a moral lesson. An epidemic becomes an omen. A rival group becomes an enemy of cosmic order. Under stress, the human mind seeks patterns. Ritual offers patterns. Monuments reinforce ritual. The cycle can become self-sealing. Yet there is a counterforce that should not be ignored. Humans are also pragmatic. They abandon places when they must. They change rituals when survival demands it. The archaeological record shows abandonment and relocation, not endless stubbornness. So the question is not whether monuments always trap people. The question is under what conditions they do. One condition may be when identity becomes tied to land and ancestry, making departure feel like annihilation. Another may be when leaders gain enough authority that admitting error threatens their legitimacy, pushing them to defend a narrative at all costs. Another may be when environmental change is gradual enough that people keep expecting the old world to return, clinging to tradition because the break has not yet become undeniable. In that slow, painful mismatch between story and reality, monuments can become both refuge and prison. Refuge because they hold the community together. Prison because they can delay necessary change. The fog deepens here because it suggests that early monumental building was not simply a triumph of coordination. It may also have been the beginning of a new kind of human vulnerability. The vulnerability of being bound to a shared symbolic system so strong that it can override direct evidence of change. If the earliest monumental spaces intensified voice, rhythm, and silence into a kind of collective certainty, then the next question cuts even deeper. When the world shifted, when coastlines drowned, climates jolted, resources rearranged, did some communities use their monuments to reinvent their stories? Or did they use them to enforce the old ones, turning architecture into an instrument for resisting truth? The last question does not leave easily. When the world shifted, did monuments help communities reinvent their stories? Or did they enforce old ones until truth itself became unwelcome? To follow that thread, the mind has to move toward the most intimate evidence the deep past sometimes preserves, the traces of how humans treated their dead. Because nothing tests a society's relationship with memory more severely than loss, and nothing reveals the mechanics of belonging more clearly than what is done with bodies that can no longer speak. Early Neolithic archaeology in several regions has produced unsettling and fascinating patterns. Burials placed beneath house floors, skulls separated from bodies, skulls curated, plastered, painted, handled as if they remained socially present. Interpretations vary, and responsible scholars debate what exactly these practices meant in each context. But the repeated appearance of such customs suggests a shared concern. The dead were not simply removed, they were incorporated. In a world without written archives, the dead are the closest thing to an unarguable past. They are also the most vulnerable past. A living person can dispute a story. A dead person cannot. That makes ancestors powerful symbols. A community can speak through them. It can claim their authority. It can turn them into proof of continuity. We are the descendants of those who lie beneath this floor. Therefore this place belongs to us. Therefore our way is correct. If that is true, the treatment of the dead becomes inseparable from early monumentality. A monumental structure can be a gathering place for ritual and a stage for memory, but it can also be a container for ancestors, either literally or symbolically. The architecture does not have to be a tomb to perform this function. It only needs to be a place where the living repeatedly encounter the idea of the dead. This may be one reason early monuments often feel so charged with presence. The carvings of animals, the standing pillars, the enclosed geometry, these can be read as a language of forces beyond the everyday. But beneath that language is a more human reality, grief and fear. If the end of the Ice Age and the early Holocene brought instability, then communities likely faced not only changing resources but changing mortality patterns. Disease can spread faster in more sedentary settings. Conflict can intensify when territory becomes valuable. Infant mortality can remain high. A society living close to survival is familiar with death, yet it is never truly normal. When death is frequent, The question becomes how to keep it from dissolving a group. Monuments can help by turning mourning into ritual. They can provide scripts for grief, where to bring the body, what words to speak, what acts to perform, how to transform loss into belonging. In that way, monuments become emotional infrastructure. They keep pain from fragmenting the group by giving pain a shared shape. But the same mechanism can harden into control. If mourning rituals define belonging, then those who are excluded from the rituals are excluded from the community. If the dead under the floor legitimize land claims, then outsiders are rendered rootless. If skull curation emphasizes lineage, then lineage becomes a boundary, memory becomes law. Here, the earlier theme of rewriting returns in a more grounded form. It is not necessary to imagine a secret elite erasing textbooks. It is enough to notice how ancestor-centered systems can reshape the past. A community can quietly elevate certain lineages and quietly forget others. It can preserve some names and let others vanish. It can reinterpret earlier events to make present claims appear ancient. The monument does not have to lie, it only has to be selective. There is also the possibility that early monumental projects themselves were entangled with the dead in ways we have not yet fully reconstructed. Intentional backfilling of structures, repeated rebuilding, the sealing of spaces. These acts can be read as ritual closure, and ritual closure often has the logic of burial. Closing a building can resemble burying a person, a farewell, a protection, a containment of something considered potent. If so, then monumental sites may carry layers of social burial, sealing not only stones but chapters of communal identity. This begins to make sense of why certain early monumental landscapes feel like they were designed for repetition and renewal rather than eternal use. A monument can be permanent as an object, yet its role can be cyclical, built, used, sealed, rebuilt. Such cycles mirror human life: birth, participation, death, remembrance, replacement. A community may build not to create one unchanging temple, but to enact the very idea of continuity through change. If monuments are instruments for negotiating with mortality, they can also be instruments for negotiating with guilt. Environmental stress and resource competition can lead to violence. Violence creates trauma. Trauma becomes difficult to carry. A society might not want to remember certain acts clearly. Monuments can help redirect attention toward a purified story, a narrative of order, ancestors, sacred obligation. In that way, architecture becomes a place where certain memories are transformed, softened, or buried. Not because someone is malicious, but because survival sometimes requires forgetting. Yet the archaeological record is too fragmentary to confirm such psychological details. It offers patterns, and the mind is tempted to fill them. The safest approach is to stay close to what is observable. Practices of burial and curation, repeated attention to ancestors, and the way such practices could logically interact with settlement, ownership, and authority. At this point, the deeper question becomes unavoidable. If early humans were building monuments partly to stabilize identity through ancestors and ritual, then monuments are not only responses to climate or economics, they are responses to the terror of impermanence. And if the dead became anchors for belonging, then the definition of belonging could become sharper, more guarded, and potentially more violent. So the fog thickens with a new suspicion. If monuments helped early communities bind themselves through ancestry, grief, and sacred continuity, what happened to those who did not fit the ancestry? Strangers, rivals, migrants, the people whose dead were not buried beneath the right floor? Did monumental society begin, quietly, by building walls made not of stone but of memory? Walls that could exclude as effectively as any fortress? The question from the last step remains sharp enough to cut. If monuments bound communities through ancestry and sacred continuity, what happened to those who did not fit? Strangers, migrants, rivals, people whose dead were not under the right floor. Monumental building often looks like unity from a distance. Up close, unity can be a political achievement, and political achievements usually have edges. The edges are where exclusion begins. One of the quiet truths of early settled life is that it changes what conflict means. Mobile groups can avoid each other, distance can be a solution. But when people become tied to specific places, fields, water sources, storage pits, sacred centres, distance becomes harder. Disputes that could once be escaped must now be negotiated, endured, or fought. And in that environment, monuments can become more than spiritual anchors. They can become claim markers. A monumental structure does not need defensive walls to function as a boundary. It can act as a centre that organises a territory around it. The more emotionally and ritually central the site becomes, the more it defines who belongs to the network that returns there. People who participate in the gatherings become insiders in a way that is difficult to imitate from the outside. They share stories, obligations, and reputations. They have ancestors connected to the place, whether literally through burials or symbolically through myth. Outsiders may be welcomed temporarily, trade, marriage, alliance, but they remain outsiders until they are woven into the ritual memory. This suggests that early monumentality could have intensified a social distinction that already existed, the difference between the known and the unknown. In a world of uncertain resources, the known network is safety. The unknown is risk. A monumental gathering site can make the known network feel not just practical, but sacred. It can elevate the boundary from preference to moral law. At the same time, early monumental projects likely required cooperation between multiple groups, not only within a single settlement. Large labour pools are easier to assemble if several communities participate. That means monuments may also be evidence of wider coalitions, alliances large enough to coordinate work across territories. Coalition building is political. It involves negotiation, gift exchange, marriage ties, conflict mediation. A monumental site can act as the physical proof of the coalition's existence. The stones stand where agreements once stood, but coalitions have a shadow. If some groups are inside the coalition, others are outside. Those outside may not accept the coalition's claims. They may contest access to resources. They may raid storage. They may retaliate. Over time, even without formal states, a landscape can become organised into zones of belonging. The monument is not merely an expression. It is a signal. This is our centre. This brings the narrative toward a delicate point, the emergence of hierarchy. Many people imagine hierarchy requires kings. In early communities, hierarchy can be softer, distributed, shifting with seasons. Yet monumental building tends to reward certain roles. The organiser, the planner, the ritual specialist, the skilled builder, the host who can provide feasts. Those roles can accumulate prestige. Prestige can become authority. Authority can become hereditary if it is tied to lineage and ancestors. And if authority becomes hereditary, then monumentality becomes a ladder. The evidence for early hierarchy is debated. Some archaeological contexts suggest relatively egalitarian household patterns. Others suggest differences in burial treatment, access to prestige items, or control of surplus. The point is not to force a single conclusion. The point is to notice that monumentality increases the opportunity for social ranking. It creates stages. It creates audiences. It creates reasons for some voices to become louder than others. Once some voices are louder, they can shape the narrative of belonging. They can decide which groups are remembered as founders and which are remembered as threats. They can frame outsiders as necessary allies or as profane intruders. A monument can help make these frames feel natural. It does this by linking social order to cosmic order. The sun rises as it should, the ritual proceeds as it should, therefore the hierarchy is as it should be. When people accept that link, disagreement becomes not merely political, but sacrilegious. This is one reason monuments can become dangerous under stress. When resources shrink or conflicts intensify, leaders who rely on sacred legitimacy may double down on ritual enforcement. If the world is failing, the story says someone must be at fault. Outsiders are convenient culprits. Internal dissenters can become outsiders as well. People accused of breaking taboo, angering ancestors, disrupting cosmic balance. The monument then becomes a courtroom without written law, a place where guilt is assigned through ritual language. Yet there is a counter-image that must be held alongside this darker possibility. Early monumental sites may also have functioned as peacemaking centres. A neutral ritual ground can reduce violence by creating shared norms and shared consequences. Feasts can redistribute food and reduce desperation. Intermarriage can reduce hostility. The same social machinery that enables exclusion can also enable integration. The stones do not tell us whether a gathering ended in alliance or in bloodshed. They only tell us that people gathered. Still, the question of violence cannot be avoided entirely, because the shift to settlement and storage changes the incentives for aggression. Stored grain is a tempting target. Livestock can be stolen. Territory becomes worth fighting over. The archaeological record in later periods shows fortifications and evidence of conflict in many regions. In the earliest phases, the signs can be subtler and debated, but the logic of risk remains. Monumental building might have been partly motivated by the need to manage these risks, by building stronger coalitions, stronger identities, stronger narratives of belonging. This is where the idea of the first walls becomes symbolic. Before stone fortresses, there can be social fortresses, myths that define insiders, rituals that define purity, ancestry practices that define legitimacy. A monument can be the centre of that fortress, because it provides a place where the story is performed and renewed until it becomes reality. If monuments could simultaneously support coalition and exclusion, peace and hierarchy, memory and selective forgetting, then they begin to look less like innocent relics and more like early experiments in social engineering. Not an engineering done with blueprints, but one done with rhythm, story, space, and awe. So the next layer of fog forms around a new tension. If early monumental building helped humans create larger coalitions and stronger identities, did it also accelerate competition between coalitions, pushing communities toward larger and larger displays, heavier and heavier claims, until monumentality itself became a kind of arms race of meaning? The tension from the last step does not dissolve, it sharpens. If early monumentality strengthened coalitions and identities, did it also accelerate competition between coalitions, turning stone into a kind of arms race of meaning? When humans discover a tool that binds people together, they rarely keep it small. Binding becomes a strategy, then a necessity, then a status symbol. And status, once visible, invites comparison. In a landscape shared by multiple communities, a monument is never only for the people who built it. It is also for the people who see it. Even if the structure is hidden within a valley or on a hill, word spreads, visitors arrive, stories circulate. Stories. A gathering becomes famous. A feast becomes legendary. The place becomes a node in a network of reputations, and reputations are fragile. They must be defended, renewed, and outshone. This is how monumentality can scale without any central government ordering it. It scales through imitation and rivalry. If one community hosts a gathering that draws allies and marriages, another community has an incentive to host a gathering as well, perhaps larger, perhaps more impressive, perhaps more sacred. The competition does not have to be violent to be intense. It can be competitive hospitality, competitive ritual, competitive claims of cosmic importance. In a world where legitimacy is performed, being impressive matters. Feasting fits into this escalation naturally. A feast is a visible conversion of stored wealth into social influence. The larger the feast, the louder the signal. We have abundance, we have allies, we can afford generosity, but feasts are costly, and costly displays require reliable food supply. This may be one reason cultivation intensifies. The social demand to host and impress can push communities to manage resources more aggressively. More planting, more herding, more storage, more labour. Monumentality and food production become entangled again, not as neat cause and effect, but as mutually reinforcing pressure. As this pressure grows, the risk grows as well. To store surplus is to invite theft. To draw large gatherings is to invite conflict. To become famous is to become a target. In that environment, communities need stronger agreements and stronger boundaries. Monumental sites can help by formalizing alliances through ritual and by broadcasting membership through participation. If someone has been seen at the sacred gathering, their status changes. They are no longer a stranger. They are part of the story. But those who are excluded become more sharply defined as outsiders. This is how a symbolic arms race can quietly evolve into something harder. When reputations are at stake, humiliation becomes dangerous. A community that loses prestige can lose allies, marriage partners, access to trade goods, even access to safe travel routes. Prestige is not cosmetic, it is survival. If monumentality becomes the main currency of prestige, then the pressure to build can become relentless. Yet here another fog rolls in, darker and more geological. The possibility that our picture of early monumentality is distorted by what has survived. Stone stands, earthworks erode, timber rots, coastlines drown. Entire chapters of construction may have existed in materials that left no trace. If so, the apparent suddenness of monumental building could partly be a survival bias. Humans may have been building large coordinated structures long before the first surviving stones, but in forms that vanished. This matters because it changes the meaning of escalation. If early monumentality was already common but mostly perishable, then the decision to build in stone might represent a turning point, a moment when communities decided that reputation and memory needed a material that could not easily disappear. In other words, stone could be the medium chosen when the stakes became high enough that forgetting was intolerable. But forgetting is not only natural, it can be strategic. In any competitive environment, there is also the urge to hide weakness. A community may not want rivals to see famine, internal conflict, disease, or failure. Ritual can disguise vulnerability by presenting stability. A monument can act like a mask. It presents an image of permanence even when the underlying system is fragile. The more fragile the system becomes, the more dramatic the mask may need to be. This is one of the most unsettling patterns in human history. The urge to build bigger when insecurity grows. A monument can be both confidence and compensation. It can be a proud declaration, and it can also be a desperate insistence that order still exists. At this point, the narrative begins to sense another missing layer in the record: the places where monumentality failed. Failed projects rarely survive in impressive form. A half-built enclosure abandoned in a crisis may be dismantled, reused, buried, or eroded. The archaeological record tends to preserve success stories. But early monumentality, like any human enterprise, must have had abandoned plans, interrupted constructions, projects that never reached completion. Those failures would be the most revealing evidence of stress, evidence that the social machine could stall. And because failure is often recycled into later success, it may be nearly invisible. So the question of competition becomes inseparable from the question of resilience. If monumentality became a currency, which communities could keep paying its cost? Which communities collapsed under the burden? And what happened to the people who lost? Did they disperse, merge into rival groups, migrate, or carry fragments of their ritual knowledge elsewhere like embers? In that sense, the arms race of meaning could have produced cultural diffusion. When a community is absorbed into another, its stories do not vanish completely. They blend, Symbols merge, rituals are borrowed. A monument may then contain layers of identity, some dominant, some submerged. The visible structure becomes a compromise between lineages, a physical treaty in stone and silence. This blending also creates confusion for later observers. When symbols appear similar across distant sites, it can be tempting to imagine a single hidden source or a lost global blueprint. The more grounded explanation is slower and more human. Networks of contact, migration, marriage, imitation, and the quiet spread of ideas through repeated gatherings. Monumentality can make that spread visible because it preserves the shared language in durable form, and still, the deeper anxiety remains. If monumentality escalated through rivalry and prestige, it may have intensified the very vulnerabilities it was meant to solve. Storage, attracting raids, gatherings attracting conflict, fixed centres reducing mobility. The monument could be both solution and amplifier. So the fog opens into a new question, shaped like a warning. If early monuments helped humans compete in prestige and coalition building, and if that competition increased risk and dependency, what happens when the system is suddenly shocked? When climate lurches, resources fail, or violence erupts? Does monumentality collapse first? Or does it become even more extreme? A final insistence carved into stone as the world begins to slip away? The warning from the last step feels almost physical. When the system is shocked, does monumentality collapse first? Or does it intensify, becoming a final insistence carved into stone as the world begins to slip away? The deep past rarely offers clean sequences. Collapse is often a slow unravelling, and intensification can happen at the same time as decline. A society can be weakening while still building, precisely because building is one of the few ways it knows to hold itself together. In the early Holocene, shock did not always arrive as a single dramatic event. Often it arrived as cumulative strain. A few bad seasons, a shift in rainfall patterns, game animals moving differently, new competitors appearing along travel routes, local resource depletion around settlements, even a small increase in conflict. Any one factor might be survivable, but combined they can push a network past its ability to cooperate. And when cooperation fails, monumentality, dependent as it is on coordinated labour, should in theory be among the first casualties. Yet the archaeological record complicates that expectation. Some monumental sites show repeated phases of construction, renovation, and deliberate closure. The pattern can look like persistence, but it can also look like an escalating attempt to maintain legitimacy. When stress rises, leaders and communities may respond by investing more heavily in the rituals that once kept the system stable. The monument becomes the emergency protocol, not the luxury. This is where the uncomfortable theme of institutional control begins to appear, not as a sensational claim, but as a social mechanism that can exist even in small-scale societies. When people fear disorder, they often seek stronger narratives. Strong narratives need guardians. Guardians can become gatekeepers. Gatekeeping is not inherently malicious, but it can shape what is remembered and what is permitted to be questioned. In a pre-literate world, the guardians of ritual are also the guardians of history. They can decide which versions of origin stories are repeated. They can choose which ancestors are emphasized. They can frame hardships as tests, punishments, or proof of sacred destiny. These choices shape behavior. And because the monument amplifies ritual, it amplifies those choices. At this point, it becomes tempting to imagine a coordinated rewriting of history in the modern sense, an organized suppression of truth. The responsible approach is more subtle. History can be rewritten without conscious conspiracy. It can be rewritten through repetition. A version of the past becomes dominant because it is performed publicly, while alternative versions survive only in private whispers or vanish as elders die. Over time, the monument becomes a physical argument. This is what we have always been. The stone does not prove it, but it makes it harder to deny. Deliberate closure and burial of structures can fit into this dynamic in multiple ways. It can be ritual renewal, sealing what is sacred, preparing to rebuild. It can be practical, repurposing space, managing debris. But it can also function as selective forgetting. Closing a space may close the memory associated with it. A change in ritual leadership might be marked by closing an older enclosure and building a new one. A shift in alliance might be marked by abandoning one sacred centre and elevating another. In such cases, the monument becomes part of political transition. The old story is buried, the new story is raised. The broader world is also shifting toward more settled lifeways, and with settlement comes a new relationship to knowledge. Knowledge becomes tied to land management, when to plant, when to harvest, how to store, how to manage animals. Mistakes become costly. As knowledge becomes more valuable, it becomes more guarded. Not all information is shared equally. Some becomes restricted to certain lineages or specialists. That restriction can look, from the outside, like secrecy. From the inside, it can feel like protection. This is one of the most subtle dangers, the human tendency to confuse secrecy with wisdom. If only a few people are allowed access to certain rituals or interpretations, the exclusivity itself can create the impression of depth. The monument, again, helps. It creates a boundary. It marks inner and outer spaces. It turns knowledge into something spatial. Some people can stand here, others must remain there. That spatial control becomes social control. And yet, for all its power, monumentality is fragile in one crucial way. It depends on surplus attention. It requires people to agree that building is worth doing even when not strictly necessary. Under sustained stress, that agreement can fracture. People may stop showing up. They may refuse obligations. They may migrate. They may resent leaders. They may begin to question whether ritual is working. If a monument is tied too strongly to a promise of rain, of stability, of protection, then failure of that promise can be catastrophic for legitimacy. This is where shock becomes dangerous. When reality contradicts ritual expectations, the system can respond in several ways. It can reinterpret the contradiction, blaming moral failure or outsider interference. It can intensify ritual, seeking to restore cosmic order through greater sacrifice and stricter obedience. Or it can fragment, with factions forming around competing explanations. Fragmentation is often invisible archaeologically, but its results are visible. Abandonment, change in material culture, relocation, the emergence of new centres, the closure of old ones. This is also the point where the theme of migration returns with force. People do not always collapse in place. They move, they join other groups, they carry knowledge and symbols with them. A monumental tradition can end not because the builders disappeared, but because the builders became someone else, absorbed, renamed, reoriented around a new centre. In that sense, the disappearance of monumentality at a site may mark not an ending, but a transformation of identity. It is here that the imagination begins to reach for the notion of resets again. Not necessarily a global catastrophe, but local and regional discontinuities that feel like resets to the people experiencing them. A ritual world can vanish within a few generations. The grandchildren of builders can grow up in a different story, with different centres, different taboos, different ancestors emphasised. The stones remain, but the meaning becomes unreadable. Later visitors may treat the site as ancient, mysterious, perhaps even dangerous. The monument becomes a ruin, and a ruin is a monument whose story has been severed. That severing is the deepest kind of loss. It is not the loss of stone. It is the loss of interpretation. It is the loss of the social code that made the structure legible. This is the moment where the past becomes truly alien. If early monumentality could intensify under stress as a defense of legitimacy, and could also collapse when legitimacy failed, then the next question is almost inevitable. When later societies encountered these older stones, already silent, already stripped of their original meanings, did they inherit them as sacred relics, as warnings, or as opportunities? In other words, once a monument story is broken, who gets to write the next one? The last question slips into the mind like a key turning slowly. Once a monument story is broken, who gets to write the next one? A ruin is not an ending. It is an invitation. The stones remain as a visible authority without an audible explanation, and that silence is fertile ground. Later communities can project onto it, adopt it, fear it, claim it, or dismantle it. In that sense, monuments do not only preserve memory, they attract new memories, sometimes like vines that cover a fallen wall. This is where the long corridor of early monumentality begins to intersect with a different kind of power. Not the power of builders, but the power of inheritors. A later society that encounters an ancient structure may interpret it through its own cosmology, using it as proof of its own myths. The older the structure seems, the more potent it becomes, because age itself feels like legitimacy. The monument becomes a witness that cannot be cross-examined. Archaeology, when careful, can sometimes detect these layers, reuse of stones, new constructions built atop old foundations, later burials inserted into earlier sites, artifacts from different periods appearing in the same location. Each layer suggests that the place remained meaningful, even as meanings changed. A site can become a palimpsest, the same surface written on again and again, the older writing not fully erased, but partially obscured. If this happened in the deep prehistory of monumental traditions, then early monuments may have had multiple lives. A structure built for one coalition could later be adopted by another. A gathering site could become a boundary marker for a new identity. A place associated with ancestors could be claimed by newcomers who adopt those ancestors in story, turning the local past into their own lineage. This is not rare in human history. Peoples move, merge, rename. Myths absorb older myths. Sacred places are re-sanctified. The stones remain. The story changes. In this light, the question, why did humans build monumental structures so early, begins to evolve into, why did humans keep returning to certain places across millennia? Because place itself becomes a technology of continuity. Even when a culture changes, a place can continue to function as a centre, sometimes because it is geographically advantageous, sometimes because it is symbolically magnetic, often both. A hilltop visible from afar, a spring that never dries, a valley that gathers people naturally, these become natural stages. Monumental building intensifies the stage, making it harder for later people to ignore. But there is also the darker side of inheritance, appropriation. When later powers encounter older monuments, they can use them as tools of authority. If an ancient structure seems to speak of the gods, then claiming it can be a way of claiming divine favour. If it seems to mark ancestral legitimacy, then controlling it can legitimize rule. In later historical periods, empires and religions have repeatedly built atop older sacred sites. The pattern is so common that it becomes almost predictable. A new order does not always destroy the old. Sometimes it absorbs it, then relabels it. This raises an uncomfortable possibility for the early Neolithic and later prehistory as well. Not a conspiracy, but a pattern. The story attached to a monument may often be the story of whoever had the power to maintain, guard, or redefine it. When the original builders vanish or merge, the site becomes available. Whoever controls the ritual access controls the narrative. In modern times, a similar process happens through institutions of knowledge. Archaeology itself, though rooted in evidence, is shaped by funding, politics, and academic paradigms. Which sites get excavated? Which interpretations get promoted? Which theories are considered respectable? These are not simple matters of truth versus lies. They are matters of human systems deciding what questions are worth asking. A monument can be reinterpreted not only by ancient inheritors, but by modern ones as well. The stories told about early sites are influenced by the cultural needs of the present. National identity, tourism, academic reputations, ideological battles about human nature. This is where the user's requested theme of a force that controls or rewrites history can be handled without drifting into fiction. The control does not have to be an organized secret cabal. It can be the slow pressure of institutions. Museums decide what to display. Textbooks decide what to emphasize. Researchers compete for grants. Sensational interpretations attract media attention. Conservative interpretations protect reputations. Over time, a public narrative forms, and public narratives can become resistant to change, even when new evidence emerges. In that sense, modern societies also build monuments, not only in stone, but in consensus. And consensus can be as stubborn as limestone. Yet the evidence continues to complicate any attempt at a single story. Monumental building appears in multiple regions across different times and ecologies. Some of the earliest known substantial constructions are not stone circles at all, but towers, walls, or communal buildings tied to early villages in the Levant. Elsewhere, megalithic traditions arise later, in Europe, in contexts often associated with farming communities. In other places, earthworks and mounds become monumental. The impulse appears again and again, suggesting that it is not a single inheritance from one mother civilization, but a recurring human response to certain conditions. The conditions, however, may share a common structure. People living at the edge of uncertainty, needing to bind themselves together, needing to make memory durable, needing to legitimize claims, needing to coordinate labor, needing to manage grief and conflict. Monumentality becomes the language these needs speak when speech is not enough. And yet, the puzzle remains. Why does this language appear so early? Why does it emerge before writing, before formal states, sometimes even before fully established agriculture? The simplest answer is that monumental building is not a late luxury of civilization. It is one of the tools by which humans become civilized in the first place, training themselves to cooperate at scale, to share narratives, to accept long-term obligations. But if that is true, it implies something unsettling. It implies that the urge to build structures that outlast individuals, structures that can legitimize power, shape memory, and command awe, may be older than kings. Older than temples in the later sense. Older, perhaps, than the idea of the individual as the primary unit of meaning. So the fog thickens around the final approach. If monuments can survive their builders and become instruments for whoever inherits them, then monumental building is not only a question of origins, it is a question of consequences. What did early monumentality set in motion inside the human mind? What habit of belief? What habit of obedience? What habit of long memory that later made empires, religions, and entire systems of history writing possible? The last question tightens into something almost intimate. What did early monumentality set in motion inside the human mind? What habit of belief? What habit of obedience? What habit of long memory that later made empires, religions, and entire systems of history writing possible? The stones do not answer directly. They cannot. But they do suggest a training regimen, a slow discipline humans may have imposed on themselves long before they had words like state or civilization. To build something monumental is to practice delayed reward. It requires people to endure effort now for a result that may not benefit them personally, or may only benefit them indirectly through reputation, identity, and belonging. This is not a minor psychological step. It is a transformation of time perception. It turns humans from creatures of immediate opportunity into creatures who can invest in invisible future value. In a sense, a monument is an externalized promise, the promise that cooperation will matter later. Once a community can hold that promise, it can hold many others. It can hold debts. It can hold hierarchies. It can hold the idea that some people are entitled to demand labour because the labour serves a shared future. Monumentality may therefore be one of the earlier schools of governance, even if no formal government exists. It teaches bodies to obey schedules, to coordinate with strangers, to accept that certain rituals must happen regardless of individual preference. It also teaches bodies to accept abstraction. A monument often represents an invisible thing, an ancestor, a mythic event, a cosmic order, a sacred boundary, a seasonal cycle. The stone is not the thing, it is the sign of the thing. Building and maintaining such signs trains the human mind to live inside symbolic systems. Once symbols become central, power can operate through symbols rather than through direct force. A leader does not need to strike. A leader needs to interpret. A leader needs to declare meaning. In that sense, early monumentality may have intensified the authority of interpreters, ritual specialists, elders, planners, people who could claim access to knowledge that others could not easily verify. When the community depends on interpretation to time gatherings, manage taboo or sustain alliances, questioning interpretation becomes risky. Doubt can feel like sabotage. This is one of the most subtle consequences of monumentality. It can convert practical coordination into moral obligation. Yet monumentality also trains something more constructive, the ability to imagine community beyond kin. Large projects can unite multiple groups that do not share close blood ties. They can create imagined communities held together by ritual participation and shared myth rather than by immediate family. This is a foundational step for larger societies. The earliest monuments may have served as laboratories where humans learned how to scale trust. Trust, however, comes with accounting. The more people involved, the more questions arise. Who contributed? Who benefited? Who owes? Who is free riding? Who is respected? Who is excluded? Monumentality makes these questions unavoidable because it demands visible contribution. It creates public work, public gatherings, public recognition. It can therefore produce both solidarity and resentment. Solidarity because shared effort feels meaningful. Resentment because effort is not always shared equally. This may be why monuments often develop accompanying social mechanisms, feasts to reward labour, rituals to sanctify obligations, myths to justify hierarchy, ancestor narratives to legitimize claims. Over time, these mechanisms can harden into institutions. What begins as a seasonal coalition can become a permanent social order. What begins as a ritual leader can become a hereditary priesthood. What begins as a gathering place can become a sacred capital. And once institutions exist, the next step is to record them. Writing, when it appears, often serves administration and legitimacy as much as it serves storytelling. It stabilizes claims and obligations the way stone stabilizes ritual memory. In that sense, writing can be seen as a continuation of monumentality by other means. The monument holds memory in space. Writing holds memory in symbols on surfaces. Both are attempts to resist the drift of oral tradition. But resisting drift has a cost. Drift is how societies adapt. When memory becomes fixed, whether in stone or text, it can become less forgiving of change. Institutions that rely on fixed narratives can become rigid. They can defend the story even when the world shifts. This is where monuments and texts can become instruments not only of continuity but of denial. At the same time, monuments are not only about control and obedience, they are also about tenderness toward time. A monument is a gift to people who do not yet exist. It is an act of care across generations, even if it is also an act of power. The same structure can comfort and dominate. A sacred site can be a place of healing and a place of exclusion. Human tools are rarely morally pure. Perhaps this ambiguity is the deepest truth monuments carry. They show that humans are capable of building for reasons that are not reducible to hunger or fear alone. Humans build because they are haunted by impermanence. They build because they desire to be witnessed. They build because they cannot accept that their stories might die with them. In the simplest terms, monuments are attempts to turn fleeting life into something that can be returned to, and yet the return is never innocent, ever. When later people return to an old monument, they bring new needs, they rewrite meaning, they claim legitimacy, they argue with the past using the past as a weapon. The monument cannot defend itself, it cannot insist on its original story. It becomes available to whoever speaks loudest in its shadow. This is why early monumentality feels like an origin point not only for architecture, but for the human relationship with truth. Once a society learns that stone can make a narrative feel permanent, it may begin to treat permanence as proof. It may begin to prefer the story that has a monument over the story that does not. In the modern world, people do something similar with archives, institutions, and official histories. What's recorded feels more real than what is remembered privately. So perhaps the earliest monumental builders did not simply ask, how can we build? Perhaps they were also, without naming it, asking, how can we make our version of reality outlast the chaos that keeps erasing everything? If that is the instinct, then the central mystery becomes less about engineering and more about the human hunger for durable meaning. And that brings the corridor toward its final turn. If monuments trained humans to cooperate at scale, to obey shared symbols, to bind the future to the present, then what happens when the training succeeds too well? When the desire for durable meaning becomes so strong that it can silence doubt, erase alternative memories, and turn stone into a judge? What, then, is a monument really guarding? Truth, or the comfort of believing that truth can be made permanent? The last question lingers like a final threshold. If the desire for durable meaning becomes too strong, a monument can begin to silence doubt. And if doubt is silenced, the line between truth and comfort becomes difficult to see in the dark. Perhaps that is the deepest irony of monumental building. Humans lift stone to resist forgetting, yet the same stone can teach them to forget selectively, to forget the uncertainty that once made them honest. It is tempting to end with a clean answer, to say that humans built monumental structures early because of ritual, or climate stress, or social cohesion, or prestige competition, or the beginnings of agriculture. All of these threads have been held in the hand, turned slowly, examined from different angles. None of them alone feels complete. The reason is simple. Monumentality is not a single cause. It is a convergence. It is what happens when ecology, psychology, and social need overlap so tightly that building becomes inevitable. The earliest monumental projects appear, again and again, at thresholds, between mobility and settlement, between abundance and uncertainty, between loosely connected bands and tighter coalitions, between memory as private story and memory as public law. At thresholds, humans feel unstable, and when humans feel unstable, they search for anchors. A monument is an anchor made visible, but anchors do not only stabilize, they also restrict. Once a community anchors its identity to a place, leaving becomes costly. Once a community anchors its story to stone, revising becomes dangerous. Once a community anchors belonging to ritual participation, outsiders become more threatening. This is the shadow that follows monumentality forward through time. The same impulse that produced cooperation can also produce rigidity. The same architecture that produced awe can also produce obedience. The same long memory that preserved knowledge can also preserve grievances. In this sense, early monumentality may have been one of humanity's first great experiments in scaling the mind. Not just scaling labour or material, but scaling belief. A small group can hold a flexible story. A large group often needs a story that is more stable, more repeatable, more enforceable. Monuments help create that stability by shaping attention and ritual. They make the story heavier, and when the story is heavy, it resists being moved by evidence. The deep past cannot tell us everything. It cannot tell us what a builder whispered to another builder while pulling a rope. It cannot tell us whether a ritual leader truly believed their own interpretations or used them cynically. They cannot tell us whether a community buried an enclosure out of reverence, fear, practicality, or political transition. The record is incomplete, and it will remain incomplete. That incompleteness is not a failure of archaeology. It is the nature of time. Yet incompleteness does not mean emptiness. There is enough evidence to suggest that humans were building forever before they had writing, and possibly before they had stable cities. There is enough evidence to suggest that ritual gatherings and symbolic systems could be complex in societies often mislabeled as simple. There is enough evidence to suggest that environmental instability and social competition can intensify the need for shared identity. And there is enough evidence to suggest that monuments, once built, become machines that shape the future, because they outlive their builders and invite new stories to attach themselves. The final warning embedded in all of this is not about ancient stones. It is about the human tendency to mistake permanence for proof. A monument feels authoritative because it is present. It occupies space. It demands attention. It makes certain interpretations feel natural simply because they have a stage. But truth is not always the story with the biggest stones. Sometimes truth is quieter, dispersed, unrecorded, drowned under rising seas, burned in timber circles that left no trace, carried in the memories of people who were never granted a place in the official ritual. When modern listeners look at the earliest monuments, they often feel the pull of mystery. That pull is understandable. It is also dangerous. Mystery can become a substitute for discipline. The real mystery is not whether a lost global civilization secretly designed everything. The real mystery is how ordinary humans, under ordinary pressures, hunger, fear, grief, love, rivalry, learn to build systems of meaning powerful enough to outlast them. The stones do not require a hidden empire to feel haunting. They only require the recognition that humans have always been capable of binding themselves to stories so tightly that those stories become reality. And perhaps this is why the question, why so early, never fully resolves, because monumentality is not a late invention. It may be one of the oldest human instincts, the instinct to externalize the invisible, to turn memory into landscape, to convert uncertainty into geometry, to make the world feel intelligible even when it is not. If that instinct is ancient, then it continues. Modern societies build monuments, archives, museums, and official histories. They build them to preserve, but also to persuade. They build them to remember, but also to choose what is remembered. They build them to honor truth, but also to protect comfort. The same paradox persists. The stronger the desire for permanent meaning, the greater the temptation to lock meaning in place. So the final image is not a conclusion, but a quiet scene. A monumental structure stands under a sky that keeps changing. Seasons pass. Languages shift. People arrive and depart. The stone remains, not as an answer, but as a question made heavy. It asks whether humans built early monuments to honor the world or to defend themselves from it. And it asks something more personal, something that can be felt even in the slow comfort of sleep. When the mind wants certainty, will it accept the gentle discipline of doubt, or will it build its own stone walls around a story and call the walls truth? In the end, the monument does not speak. It only waits. And the waiting itself feels like a warning, as if time is asking softly whether what humans built to resist forgetting might also be what taught them how to forget.